Afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Innovate Finance for inviting me to speak here today. So, fintech is one of those industries we can genuinely call global. Really think about it as a global community. And the international element of fintech, I think, is inextricably linked to its future success. And for us as a regulator, when we think about how we work in this space, actually the degree of international cooperation we already have is one of the hallmarks of the regulation that we do here. In previous years, I've been fortunate enough to have the opportunity to stand in the same space and talk to you about a number of things that we've been doing in terms of our innovation work. So from the launch of our regulatory sandbox to a range of other developments that we've had. Since we started our innovation work nearly 4 years ago, we've worked over 500 firms through the FCA's Innovate program, and we've worked with around 70 in depth through our sandbox. It's one of the most large-scale and complex regulatory sandboxes in the world, and we've worked with firms from as far afield as the US, South Africa, and Singapore, amongst other countries. So as we look to the next stage of our innovation journey, it's perhaps only natural that having an international element to it should be part of the picture. So today, I'd like to talk about that vision for an international element to our work and what role we want the FCA to play in a much wider picture. So as most of you will know, sitting here today, our innovation story began in 2014 with the launch of Project Innovate. The purpose of Innovate was, and still remains, to help firms tackle regulatory barriers to innovation, through whether that's clarifying our own expectations, whether it's examining our rules, or being prepared to enact policy changes. The whole idea is to give firms the space they need to innovate in the interests of consumers. And central to this, since 2016, has become our regulatory sandbox, a safe space where businesses can test the most innovative products, services, business models, or delivery mechanisms in a real market with real consumers. We were the first regulator to attempt a project of this type. And in order to do it, we had to change some perceptions, both for firms and indeed for ourselves. We had to have a big job on our hands to make sure that firms found us easy to work with, that we were knowledgeable about some of the challenges they faced in launching new products and propositions. A shift of mindset was also required inside our building, from the traditional regulatory mindset of what is the risk to asking what's the risk if we don't do this. And when we asked ourselves that question, we found that the risk of not opening up markets to innovation was bigger than the risk of taking that leap. The sandbox has been as much an experiment for us as it has been for the firms that have taken part in it. But I have to say, for a calculated risk, we believe the bet has really paid off. Since the launch of the sandbox, we've seen firms reduce the time they take to get innovative ideas to market. In fact, 90% of the firms that took part in our first cohort have gone to market, and many of those have found it far easier to gain the funding they needed as a result of participating in the sandbox. We've also seen the take-up of the sandbox by large firms who might otherwise have not had the confidence to try new ideas in the wider market. And through sandbox firms being closely supervised during their time they test with us, we've learned an enormous amount about how new technologies are really working and actually how they develop in practice. So we know this approach is working. The question for us is it enough? Now, over the last couple of years, we've seen a trend coming that's becoming impossible to ignore. Increasingly, we're hearing from firms that demand to operate globally, to grow at real scale and real pace. They want us to be able to work with other regulators across the globe, conduct tests at the same times. And through the sandbox, we've seen 30 applications that come from outside of the UK, and we've gone on to support 11 of them already. And many of those firms are simultaneously trying to test in other countries' sandbox or innovation programs. So it's very clear to us which way the wind is blowing here. Nor is international cooperation around fintech new to us. Over the last few years, we've signed 10 cooperation agreements with 8 different jurisdictions, allowing us to share market trends, collaborate on projects, and refer innovative firms across markets. But currently there is no joint sandbox program with other regulators for firms to participate in. And such a prospect and a project would represent very new territory for all of us. Now, breaking new ground obviously carries an element of risk. It's not something, as I've said, that traditionally regulators are particularly comfortable with us. But, and this is a big but, our history with Innovate has been about doing things that regulators historically have not done or necessarily felt comfortable with. Now, to face those risks and do that in a responsible way, we need to ensure we have the right controls in place. But all the time, we need to keep coming back to this point. What is the risk of not engaging here? What's the risk of not doing some of these things? So we're up for the challenge. Now, naturally enough, as you'd expect of a regulator, though, we want to do our homework. So last month, we invited stakeholders to share with us their views on what could a global sandbox begin to look like. The responses range from regulators to startups, from challengers to large firms, from trade bodies to think tanks, make for fascinating reading. As expected, there's a lot in the idea about cross-border testing. People really like the concept. The benefits it could bring, such as reducing cost and complexity, to manage to allow firms to accelerate expansion into other jurisdictions, particularly for those smaller firms, perhaps, who are keen to expand internationally. In terms of the jurisdictions that respondents are keen to see included, the US, understandably, featured high up on the list. But so did South America, Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Europe. African countries like South Africa and Kenya also featured in a number of responses, and I don't think that should be any surprise to us when you consider how new models of banking have grown up there. When it came to how a global sandbox might work in practice, we saw some really creative suggestions. The idea of a global dictionary which covered data needs across different jurisdictions and different countries, to a joint mission statement from those regulators who might want to take part. And overall, suggested to oversee this would be a college of regulators, a consortium of representatives from participating regulators, all basically willing to try this new way of working together. So what do we think? So first of all, it should be practical. Establishing a global sandbox is an immense undertaking, and we have to be realistic about the task in hand. Now, in some quarters, there was an aspiration for global standards, and I understand that. The logic is very clearly there. But we're talking about a very, very fast-moving market, and my strong suspicion is that kind of negotiation would probably take about 20 years, and by the time we were there, we'd be 19 years and 6 months out of date with our answer. So we need to be pragmatic. Secondly, we should work with and through international bodies where we can. We're already working closely with international colleagues in IOSCO, for example. And to avoid running before we can walk, we might want to start with those jurisdictions that have already got established sandboxes or innovation hubs. Thirdly, this model needs to let us do something practical. We need to be able to experiment with what works. So we could see a different range of sandbox tests. For example, a single test in one country collecting data that many could use, or the idea that many have grasped onto of simultaneous testing in more than one jurisdiction. Fourthly, the membership should be flexible. We shouldn't assume that all regulators would want to be engaged in every test, although of course we should share knowledge and learnings widely. And fifth, and perhaps most of all, the key to this is collaboration. There has to be a joint effort across international regulators, not a UK global sandbox. Because clearly we can't do it alone. We may well want to start to kick off the discussion, but we won't have much success if we're just talking to ourselves. So now's the time to bring fellow regulators from around the world into the conversation. In fact, collaboration, I believe, will run like through the next chapter of the UK's fintech story, like the letters through a stick of rock. Later this week, we start work with interested regulators, including colleagues across Europe, the US, Far East, on a blueprint for how this global sandbox might work. There's real momentum behind this, and we hope before long we will actually see the reality of the ambition of a global sandbox come to fruition. Now, participating in a global sandbox would represent a truly momentous step forward in the UK's fintech journey. But we think it should do more than just let innovators test their own ideas. One option we want to explore is the power of this sandbox to solve global problems. In many conversations I have with colleagues, I hear them grappling with exactly the same challenges as us, whether they're from Sydney or Singapore. Can we use the Global Sandbox to tackle the questions occupying the minds of the international community? Questions that could have huge ramifications for financial services and beyond. So I want to give you one example of this, and it is only one example. The anti-money laundering effort for the anti-money laundering effort to work, controls need to work across boundaries. There can't be fragmentation. It's an area where we all have skin in the game across multiple jurisdictions. The UN estimates the full global scale of money laundering to be 1.6 trillion annually. And it's all our interest to apply our joint expertise in trying to tackle it. So that's why in May, we're bringing together international partners from the US, Europe, Australia, Japan, Korea, in what we call a tech sprint, which will focus specifically on developing solutions to the challenges money laundering, financial crime, and terrorist financing provide. Now, this will be the 5th tech sprint we've held. These events draw on the expertise of software developers, data scientists, and subject matter experts. We work together in cross-industry groups to develop real, tangible solutions to critical problems in financial services. And they create real results. From previous tech sprints, we've seen commercial partnerships established between several large firms. We've seen banks starting to take forward regulatory reporting into a production environment. Our ambition for the AML event is no less. What we want to see is a first step in establishing a deep international dialogue around the role of technology in tackling money laundering and criminal finance. We see the tech sprint as a real catalyst for change, not just a talking shop. So to conclude, 3.5 years after we launched Project Innovate, our belief in the transformative role of technology and improving outcomes for consumers has not wavered. In fact, our ambitions are greater than ever before. The opportunities are there for the taking, and certainly from a regulatory perspective, we are poised to grab them with both hands. But we can't do this alone. Finance is a truly global sector. It only makes sense that we tackle these challenges, the challenges of our age, together. So fostering innovation and collaboration will be absolutely central to what we do next. And we hope that you will all join us on the next stage of that journey. Thank you very much.